Yes, it's December 4th, and that means, for all intents and purposes here on the EIB network, it's Christmas time. And that's because we love it. And so it doesn't come too soon for us. 800-282-2882 if you want to be on the program. Open line Friday. Okay, here's how it works, folks. And I mentioned in the first half hour that much of this comes from Andrew McCarthy, who's written extensively about Islam. He's tried cases against noted figures such as the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. Put him away, in fact, as the United States attorney. So Rudy Giuliani goes on television the day after San Bernardino, says, well, if you can't see this as an act of terror, you're a moron. And yet, even as we sit here at this very moment, our government still will not call it an act of terror. They will not even call it terrorism. They're looking, as I've just previously discussed, for any other number of alternative explanations. Why? What's going on here? Well, it goes like this. Our government denies that terrorism is caused by Islamic doctrine. Now, that is true, and it is a declarative statement. It's not arguable. This administration, and even in prior administration, the Bush administration, went to great lengths to exempt Islam from terrorism. They say Islam is a religion of peace, and terrorism is not really Islam. It's a weird, way-out bastardization of it, but it is not Islam. McCarthy decided to read the Quran as part of his preparation for trial because he couldn't believe this guy, the blind sheikh, some of the stuff he was saying. It had to be vitriol, it had to be wacko extremism, and it wasn't. He found out it was right from the scripture. That the blind sheikh and all that he was discussing and promoting was right from the book. But our government refuses to see that and instead claims that terrorism is not part of Islamic doctrine. Islam, the religion of peace, and any terrorism that happens is not really Islamic or Islamic inspired. This is called a willful blindness. It's also political correctness. Our government is in denial of radical Islam as written, unwilling to deal with Islam as it is. The government has to make up an Islam of its very own. Regardless of the abundance of evidence to the contrary, the United States government holds that Islam is a religion of peace, case closed. They have made up their own version of Islam to avoid having to deal with the reality of Islam, because it's just too daunting, frightening, scaring, whatever, and they don't want to deal with it. Therefore, to the government, terrorism committed by people who happen to be Muslim is not in any way a reflection of legitimate interpretation of Islam. You might find this hard to believe, but if you're doubting any of this, just go search your own memory. All the times that we have heard that Islam's a religion of peace and that we can't use the word terrorism to describe it, and Obama will not use it. And then remember all the times that this administration actually claims that violence by right-wing white Christians poses a greater threat people of this country than Islam. Islam's a religion of peace, and anybody conducting terrorism in the name of Islam is a liar and a fraud. They are bastardizing the religion of peace. So again, to the government, terrorism committed by people who are Muslim is not a reflection on the legitimate interpretation of Islam, even if Islamic supremacist ideology, which endorses jihad violence. Islam, standard mainstream Islam, endorses jihad violence, but our government doesn't want to admit that or deal with it. Here in America, as in Western Europe, this is the key to understand, the violence is deemed anti-Islamic, meaning Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they can't be Islamic. Islam is the religion of peace. They are bastardizing it. They are frauds. They are calling themselves Islamic, and they are calling themselves Muslim, but they are not. Because Islam is as anti-terror as you and I are. Islam is the religion of peace. I'm telling you what our government's position is. The U.S. military position. The FBI, you name it, this is why they will not call these acts of terror, because if they have any connection to Islam, it can't be, because Islam is the religion of peace. And Islam, genuine, real Muslims are as opposed to Al-Qaeda and ISIS as we are. That is what has been dictated to our law enforcement agents by their superiors. If those were your instructions and you have a terror attack and you're out there reporting to the media trying to answer questions, you'd sound like a babbling buffoon too. Because you'd have to come up with ways to violate the very common sense you know is true. So what are the policy implications of the government and this fantasy Islam? What are the policy implications of a United States government that believes Islam is as anti-terror as you and I are? Well, it means that Islamic doctrine can never be cited as the cause of terrorism, as a matter of policy. And it never is. It never is. This leads, for example, to what is happening right now, this very day, this preposterous hand-wringing over radicalization. We are supposed to believe that young people like Saeed Farouk, climate change, who just happens to be Muslim, spontaneously, out of the blue, for no reason whatsoever, he was provoked by a coworker or radicalized by his wife, all of a sudden became mean and angry, a radicalized terrorist, but that's not who he really was. Just a young guy running around living his life, and then something or a series of things happened to radicalize him. As if there were no doctrine, as if there were no body of thought that was inducing the radicalization. It's so absurd. I can understand that some of you think that this makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense. That's the point, folks. It doesn't make any sense. So here you have peaceful, blending into the background, cheap, poor little beard people are making fun of, little guy named Saeed Farouk. And all of a sudden becomes radical. Radicalized by what? Not just by who, but by what? What radicalized him? Well, it isn't Islam. No, because Islam is the religion of peace. So it must be ISIS. Yes. So the news today that this guy was influenced by ISIS is not the administration getting close to calling this terrorism. This is a classic example of the government taking the occasion to say it isn't. Because Islam is as opposed to ISIS as you and I are. Because Islam is the religion of peace. ISIS is bastardizing Islam. And if this little guy has been radicalized by his wife or by ISIS or whatever, it's further proof that Muslim/Islamic terrorism is not at play here. And it ultimately leads to the decree or the belief that terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, therefore, are not Islamic. You have to conclude that they're either just bad people, they're just wanton murderers, or they're mentally deranged, or they're sick, or they've been hijacked or perverted or whatever, but they have perverted and they have hijacked Islam, because Islam's a religion of peace. This is, I'm telling you what our government's position is, and it has been since prior to Obama, by the way. Islam as a religion of peace can have nothing to do with these acts of terror. So if the cops come upon a mass murder attack that is clearly instigated by Islamic doctrine, they are not permitted to conclude that it is terrorism because they have been directed by their superiors in law enforcement to maintain that Islam is against terrorism. It's part of the propaganda that your kids are taught, part of the propaganda the media spreads, that Islam is a religion of peace and is against terrorism, not sponsoring it, not doing it. Thus, the law enforcement agents believe they cannot call terrorism terrorism unless and until they uncover evidence proving that the Muslim mass murderers have some tie to a designated non-Islamic terror group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And bingo, what do we get today? ISIS, there's an ISIS connection. And once again, none of this has anything to do with Islam. That's how it works at the highest levels of our government. Back after this.